And yes, thank you for all the support and context over these emerging years. And it definitely is still a potential as opposed to a proven sort of impact. And so we'll have to see how it goes. And what I want to tell you about today is why I find participatory mHealth, mobile health, and this particular form of mobile health so interesting, and the sort of work we've been doing with my hat at UCLA, and I'll be seeding the way all along for this more community-facing open mHealth effort, and mentioning it all along, but definitely coming back to it at the end. So I actually have two hats. I'm a professor at UCLA. I'm an odd sort of computer scientist. I'm not necessarily an odd sort of person for informatics or for an iSchool, but I am odd for my relatively staid and traditional computer science department, and I'll be narrating a little bit of that. I also have another hat as of September 1, which is that with a colleague, Ida Sim from UCSF, from the School of Medicine, we've launched a nonprofit called openmhealth.org with seed funding from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and California Healthcare Foundation. And so that will be an increasing outlet for the things we're trying to do in a community we're trying to create. Then I'll try to be a little bit clear where useful which hat it is. So just for my own edification, how many of you are from where your primary hat is in computer science? School of Information, public health and other things in that direction? Okay, interesting. You have a big head. I haven't always said that about you. You have room for two hats. Okay, so when I'm speaking to computer science audiences, the reason I suggested a brief bio is that it helps me to narrate a little bit how I got to this. I think it's useful because I'm not, many of you have been working in clinical space much longer than I have, so I just want to be clear about where I might have any credibility and where I don't. Okay, so I am by background internet, came out of graduate school doing internet protocol design. And I'm old, this was starting in the later part of the 80s, teaching internet protocol design when you had to explain to people why you weren't teaching the OSI 7-layer reference model out of fairness and why TCP/IP was the only protocol stack worth teaching. Okay, so that clearly dates me. It was before people knew what the internet was, but there was this amazingly high impact thriving community, which is how the internet came about, called the IETF, that started to form, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which was formed by these organic working groups of people working in places where reference implementations, rough consensus, running code was the sort of mantra for the IETF. Standards emerged out of it, but they emerged after you had sort of prototypey implementation. So that's the style of work that has always been then the way I've liked to work. And so I stayed in internet protocol design for a long time, very applied. I have huge respect for theoreticians, but I'm not one. So I'm very much driven by having some chance of things seeing the light of day. But in my early career had nothing to do with applications. So in those days, protocol designers, applications were sort of dirty, right? Less general, less abstract. The only people who did applications were those who couldn't really design protocols. And that was sort of the first 15 years of what I did. And I transitioned into something that we came to be known as wireless sensor networks or distributed sensing. And in that transition, came to what in retrospect is the obvious realization, which is that to do distributed sensing, distributed data collection without having a sense of what the data is being used for is sort of a vacuous act, unless you're doing it very theoretically. And so I began to work very closely with application folks. In that context, it was ecologists, environmental engineers, seismologists. And in that process, and I'm finally getting to the topic of the talk, mobile phones started getting a lot more interesting. It's around 2005, 2006. Actually, in 2005, I was invited to a workshop in northern Finland in February by some people at Nokia who I'd never heard of. It was still a letter, paper letter arrived. And it was a small workshop, 25 people, and they advertised that we were going to work from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. and then go out dog sledding and snowmobiling on the frozen lakes of northern Finland. And my significant other said, we got to go. Right? I'm not really into boondoggles, but we went. And it turned out probably to be one of the most high-impact meetings I've ever been to. Henry Thierry, now CTO or whatever he is at Nokia, and Nokia at the time was really on an upswing, where it is now. But at that time it was on an upswing. It was way before iPhones, and their phones were really starting to be interesting. Even though it was Symbian, they were more programmable. And what was interesting about mobile phones, as opposed to my world of distributed sensing, is that mobile phones are more general purpose or multi-purpose. And that multi-purpose aspect to these devices is what has me so focused on them, and focused on them much more than other external and wireless devices that are clearly of interest and applicable in a range of situations. But I'll be talking really about leveraging the mobile smartphone. And so from internet to distributed sensors instead of routers to mobile phones as an interesting platform for that distributed data collection, particularly because mobile phones, unlike placed sensors, move through the environment. And so you're getting a lot of information more than when you just stick a sensor in one particular place. And then from mobile phones to mobile health, because if you're collecting data around something, around people, health and wellness is one of those places where there's this biggest gap to fill in terms of bringing more data and more visibility and more interaction to the problem. So that's sort of my bio and genealogy sort of connected together. I'm working in mobile health for the last several years, and I'll be describing that work to you. Highly collaborative. I'm not able to do anything by myself anymore. Mobile health is a term I didn't create, right? It's created, existed as a term before I started doing any work in the field. And in the global space, particularly in developing regions, it often refers to extending the reach of systematic care by having smart devices be in the hands of field workers and clinical workers. So great tools like Open Data Kit and a lot of interesting work at the Millennium Villages projects and a number of other projects around the world. Great work, not what I do and not what I'll be talking about, okay? So what I've been particularly focused on, my experience has been more domestic, and it's about the mobile device in the hand of the individual collecting data and interacting with data about themselves, as opposed to in the hand of the clinical care worker. Not because it's better, but that's where I'm focused. And so now when I use the term mHealth, consider it in that more constrained context. So it's about patient self-care, and in this context, a lot of opportunity for innovation. And it's about patient self-care largely, initially, outside the context of traditional enterprise health IT. One of the more hopeful aspects of this now, it should come together. This data should come into our traditional care loops, and I'll be talking about that. But we see, as you see in other aspects of what's referred to as consumer healthcare, that there's an opportunity here for the innovation to be coming in from the edges. In one slide, it's about using our mobile devices to help to capture and report on our actions through a combination of intentional smart self-report, whether you call it ecological momentary assessment or whether you call it experience sampling, as well as automated data streams that come off of sensors on the devices, as well as off of the other applications we're using the devices for. The challenge and the interesting parts of the problem are in the sense making from that data, mashing it up with other data, historical comparisons, and so forth, and bringing that data back both to an individual and to the clinician. So that's sort of the one slide version of what I'll be talking about. So what I mean by mHealth, I'm going to describe an example software system and mostly the supported pilots. There is nothing particularly novel about any of the ways we've built the system. So when a computer science researcher looks at this software system, it's almost intentionally not novel. We're just using a lot of existing components. Where I think the novelty is in practitioners in this space who want to bring novel tools to patients, well people, clinicians, public health, and so forth. And I will then talk about where some of the open research challenges are. This is a space in which I'm primarily excited by all the research we don't have to do in computer science to make this happen. I mean, there's so many existing powerful tools that we can have impact from a technical readiness perspective in the short term. from a system readiness perspective in terms of the larger healthcare delivery system, that's clearly a different story. So examples help. These are the examples I wish I was doing. I will then tell you about the pilots we've actually done to learn about this, which are, what do you guys call these things? Convenience samples. So the pilots we actually do are convenience pilots, where we found people who had cohorts and that fit in some existing funding structure and such. Whereas I'm hoping that we'll be able to increasingly move towards where I think the biggest impact can be in some of these things. So in that whole big space of obesity, diabetes, pre-diabetic, managing the combination of diet, exercise, and associated things around fatigue, stress. Mental health, if I only could work in one sort of area in this space, it would be in mental health. I think the biggest delta that mobile devices bring are when there are no blood tests, no blood pressure cuffs, the only way in which we get feedback into the system in terms of how the individual is doing is actually through self-report. And this is something that allows us to systematize and increase the resolution and veracity of that form of self-report, and I'll say more about that. But you can think of lots of other applications and things that are typically perhaps not on not the most acute problems, but the ones that people deal with most intensively and tend to do a lot of seeking of alternative ways of trying to manage it, right? So if you ask a dermatologist, think of acne, teen acne. When I ask dermatologists, what is the time delay? First of all, if you ask a dermatologist, is there evidence that dietary intake affects acne outbreak? What's the answer?
Yes.
When I ask my dermatologist at UCLA, they say no. And when I say, okay, if there was going to be such evidence, can you just tell me what the delay is between consumption and outbreak? Right? We know it's not like a bee sting. You don't have an allergic reaction, right? What is that? Is it hours? Is it days? Unknown. Okay? I'm in a very researchy, as I sometimes say about my colleagues there, you go into medical school and at random grab one of the faculty members, you're going to grab a scientist, not a clinician. So it's a slightly different emphasis. Anyway, I'll be talking more about these types of motivating applications, but in places like dermatology where people are trying to discover those connections for themselves, and many people end up managing, whether it's based on their perception or what they've learned about themselves and making those connections, these are tools that can help people be more scientific or systematic in making those connections and collecting that kind of data. Do you guys have a quantified self community locally in Ann Arbor? You guys know what quants are? Not of the Wall Street variety? So how many of you know about the quantified self movement? Okay, so, and the rest of you didn't raise your hand. So in that, quantified self, when it first started to emerge, I had the reaction, sort of, the words that came to mind when you say quantified self were sort of narcissistic and OCD, right? But I think that that's moved on, actually. And they're an interesting sort of vanguard in some of it for the kinds of things that you could bring to people in a more modest, accessible variety. So the overall hope here, that potential that Chuck referred to, and where I see where the power of this comes from, comes back to my comment about things being a multi-purpose device. First of all, these are the devices that people choose to carry around with them and they use to mediate their lives. Therefore, as a conversation I had earlier, right, if this isn't a device that people are using to mediate their lives or don't want to, it's not necessarily the right place to start. So I don't do any pilots to date with elderly, for example. There are some early adopters in the elderly population. I'm not sure that right now, for our elderly population now, that this is the right device. For both reasons, that it isn't something that is natural and native to them. They're not otherwise using it. And also, they're not quite out and about as much. So you can maybe get more bang for the buck and a fair amount of understanding their lives if you do some instrumentation around where they live. So I try to be pragmatic, and that's my pragmatic. So 15 to 55, aside from the fact that it sort of sounds good, is where I think of this, and where we found very little digital divide, particularly down at the latter part of it. So independent of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, you give this to a teenager or a young adult, a smartphone with a graphical interface, and it's extremely intuitive, easy to use, and pleasant to use from that perspective. So first thing about mobile phones is they're an instrument of convenience. It's not because it's the perfect device. I used to have a little tagline on my slides that says, if you can't go to the field with the sensor you want, go with the sensor you have. But that became dated since we're way past Rumsfeld, right? You said that about Rumsfeld. And so if you don't have this device or somebody doesn't want it, and they're not going to be using it for other aspects of their lives, and if you have to give it to them as an extra phone, not really the best thing. But when it is what somebody is using to mediate their life, and they're making sure it's charged and that it's on them so that they can hear from their kids or grandkids or friends or whoever, it's really very powerful from that perspective, and we can begin to use it for other things. And then the other way in which this is that whole notion of what's the power of the internet is all the applications and things for which it was used that nobody anticipated, but that same infrastructure really allowed so much to happen. We didn't have to put out new infrastructure as these new applications emerged. And the same thing goes with respect to the somewhat subtler point about this serving multiple feedback loops. So we're interested in starting with these applications serving the individual in their self-management. So if you build a tool that is useful for the individual and serves that feedback loop, of course you know where you are at this exact moment in time. You maybe know how you feel, maybe not if somebody doesn't ask you, as we were sort of talking about last night. But the notion of sort of supporting people being able to see their behaviors, have it reflected back at them, support behavior change, support reminders, and do applications that are useful to a person in their self-management. Then, using that same data to inform the clinical care loop. So, bringing and to have the self-management be informed by what's best understood around clinical practice. So it's not all just consumer-driven, what can the quants think of, right? But it's actually bringing in clinical models to understand what might be useful in that self-management, pulling that same data off, summarized in different ways to inform the clinical care. And then, as researchers, pulling the exhaust off of those data streams to begin to build up an aggregate. So it's not the top-down, figure out a large epidemiological study, okay, instrument a bunch of people and learn from it, and then inform how should they take care of themselves. That is a great additional loop. When you have large-scale use, what you learn at the aggregate about how people actually take care of themselves or manage their outbreaks or their relapses or flare-ups, from psoriasis to MS, right? You'll learn at that aggregate level. But start by building people tools from which you'll have that resolution of information that they'll stay committed to using that's helping them already, and build up to those additional loops. And that's what really is, I think, sort of deep and powerful about working in this space. And what's hard about it is actually pulling the data out, making meaning of it, both for the individual and for the clinician. So as I'll go on to describe, I think it's relatively easy to capture the data now. To do the sense making is where the challenges remain, and that's just going to be because there are going to be lots of, hopefully, a lot of iteration and piloting in that space. Okay, so with my UCLA hat, as the way in which we've been exploring this space for the past few years is by going out there and supporting people's pilots, where we could find people with clinical stories, where they wanted to support patient self-monitoring in support of clinical or research. And because we've been evolving this one software platform, everything I do is open source. So with all the caveats about level of maintainability and such of that, the source is available there. And we've been evolving the software system so that we have one software system that supports these range of pilots that we're doing. This word campaign management is an odd one. It comes from the lineage that we use this same sort of methodology and approach for people doing data collection about things in the environment as data collection about themselves. In fact, the work on the mobile side started with what we call participatory sensing, and so people who are more looking at the social and environmental factors, determinants around health or around other things, would use this as a way of doing systematic data collection, from looking at sustainability practices to invasive plant species growing on your favorite trails as a whole. And that fit this notion of there being these data campaigns, these things around which you're collecting data, need a better term for that when it comes to self. That's clearly an odd one. So there's a notion of creating what these particular experiments or exercises or data collections are, and it's always a combination of mobile and things on the server side. Nothing we do is ever just a mobile app, and in fact the mobile app is the easier part of the story. The heavy lifting is more done on the server side. These are the clinical pilots that have informed our development most heavily. Very early one with the survivorship program with Patty Gans. 2 studies that are ongoing now that have gone through multiple phases. They're in their last phase now. One, new moms who have cardiovascular risk factors doing self-monitoring around diet, stress, and exercise. I'll say more about that. Another one around risk behaviors for people living with HIV. Similar approach, but being used in a very different population with some colleagues at Northwestern for South Asian immigrant populations. And I'll say a little bit more about each of these as examples. We are doing one with a small pilot with young adults with ADHD. If I had to choose one demographic, it would be young adults, particularly all the things that come up as they leave the structure of the home and before they have a more structured home life of their own. There's that 18 to 28 region there when I think there are particularly interesting opportunities. And a great collaboration happening now in the context of open mHealth with the VA and the National Center for PTSD Research. If you have an iOS device, there's an Android version too, but easier to find for iOS. PTSD Coach is a really nice example of an application that was designed by a group of clinical psychologists who sat down and thought hard about how could they use mobile devices to complement what they do in therapy. So what does the system look like? Functionally, we've designed it over time to sort of support the set of features that apply across these different applications, and it's also bottom up in that we have a feature, we go and say to an application, hey, do you want to use this? So they fed on one another. In terms of the type of data that's captured, so first of all are your basic surveys, right? Not the standard surveys that you ask a patient to fill out as clinical context for their treatment, not the thing you ask them once a year or maybe once every 6 months. These are experience sampling or ecological momentary assessment. Which of those terms do you guys use? How many of you use EMA? Experience sampling. Okay, so I think I started out referring to it as EMA and then actually discovered the person whose name that I will mispronounce, Csikszentmihalyi. How do you guys say his name? Yeah, did I say that right? And that early incredible experience sampling work in the 80s with paper and pagers, right? And smartphones are really have brought the feasibility of using experience sampling to just a different place, which we see. So in the system that we call Homage, you can author just through a simple configuration file. It's an XML. We'll probably change it to JSON, and we'll have a web UI. But right now, it's just a simple scripted way in which you can, like SurveyMonkey, you can think of it as just a mobile SurveyMonkey, script these different forms of questions. Now, scripting these questions is the easy part. Translating your measurements from what you ask somebody every 3 months or even every 2 weeks to something that's relevant to ask them once a day or multiple times a day, that's a different story, right? It's easy to author it and have the software come up and ask them those questions. What you need to ask and what is meaningful to ask at that resolution and that's not retrospective, that's where with every condition and demographic and over time, I think we're just starting to learn, right? If you take the standard questions around ADHD where people are reporting on their symptom levels and you ask it multiple times a day, it's absurd. You just have to look at those questions and do that. And so a lot of the instruments, the standard ones and otherwise, are actually not yet adapted to something that fits experience sampling. Okay, do experience sampling. When you do experience sampling, it's you have the opportunity to do time and location prompting. You can let both the clinical side, the designer of this application, say what number of reports they want a day, to what extent they want it prompted, what times a day. But you can also have the participant then configure that into times that fit their schedule, right? If you're doing a quick sleep survey, you want it to be when they get up. You might have a set notion of when that is. You have to make sleep surveys that happen in the morning, happen according to somebody's schedule, whether they're on a night shift or they're a student, right? The time at which they get up is a variable thing. So you balance, and then you end up with much noisier data, right? So you can't. It's not that everyone is getting this delivered at the same time of day, and the more rigid you are as a researcher from your methodology, you're always somewhat in tension with the usability on the user side. And so that's where some of the nice opportunities are then when the data comes out messier data is more of an opportunity on the research side, of course. So these are location and time triggered. They're location and time coded automatically, and they're automatically uploaded whenever you have connectivity. In addition, we do automated capture, automated capture in the form of actigraphy, so sampling the accelerometry on the phone, as well as mobility. So you can get features out such as time, sedentary versus moving, but you can also get a sense of somebody's mobile footprint. What time are they getting up and getting to work or school in the morning? How out and about are they on the weekend versus not? Those are not really so relevant as absolute measures, but if you want to look at in-person variance, as you have them on a new medication regime, for example. So let's come back to the example of treating a patient for depression. Putting them on a new medication, a new dosage, a new mix, right? And having them come back 2 weeks later and how are you doing? Relative to the previous one. It's a self-report, it's a retrospective self-report. So the opportunity to bring a little bit more, both through their experience sampling around that question, how are you doing, that it's more of a daily notion or seeing sort of times of day that might dominate their lows or highs, but also just looking at that mobility footprint. How is their shift in time that they're getting out and about shifted relative to this, to the new care plan. In some of our work with particularly these new moms, one of the things that is still very difficult to capture in this way is around dietary intake. Okay, so as I say before, dietary intake, there's not a really externally measurable trigger to know when to be capturing. And so if you say to people, take pictures of your food when you eat, I think it's a reasonable thing to try to use, but those who are going to be best at doing it are those who need it the least, right? You're hitting on that same behavior that you're trying to address. And so dietary intake remains one of those really puzzling places to get any clear inventory around. But if you maybe then focus on certain types of eating, like if you ask people to try to monitor their snacking, or when they eat something that they didn't intend to eat when they got up in the morning, right? So do you have a notion of what what you're planning to eat that day, if this is one of the things you're trying to manage. And you can try to say, people, try to raise your awareness of things that you're eating that were sort of not in plan, and just note those things. It's not a time when they might want to fill out a full survey, but for that and stress, we just developed a very lightweight notion of a phone top button. So stress is probably even a better example. When we dealt with our moms in focus groups, they said, we're not going to answer surveys about why we're stressed when we're stressed. Okay? So what came out of actually a focus group design was instead, on the phone top, there's a stress button. And all you have to do is tap it, and it records the time and location of a stress event. And then gives you an opportunity then to look at your own heat map of where those stress events might be. And again, entirely anecdotally at this point, one of the moms who was in an early round of prototype testing had reported previously that her major stress was at work, and then after doing this noted that most of her stress events were actually upon arriving home, and in that transition from work to home. And so it really is just experience sampling, but it's taking it down to just a simpler way of doing it. And then I think of growing value here are other phone-based activities. So in the example of our ADHD in young adults application, in addition to things around medication reminders, around sleep hygiene and patterns, because that's always a difficult thing with managing meds, and as sleep schedule shifts and then meds interfere with sleep, and there's all this not very good form of positive feedback in that. There's just self-report on the level of your symptoms. You know, how well did you, the standard questions they ask around, you know, were you focused at work, did you lose things, did you misplace them, those sorts of symptomology. And so what we've added to that is just taking a tool that's used in a standard laboratory environment, this go, no-go test, the cognitive control test, where you're asked to whether you hit the space bar, in this case you're tapping on the screen as it's flashing up letters of the alphabet, for example, and you're supposed to tap it as quickly as you can unless it's an X, right? So that ability to exert that cognitive control. And so it just becomes another little bit of somewhat more objective within-person within-person variance. So the data, when you play that game for 30 seconds or a minute, the data of how many positive, you know, false negatives, false positives, et cetera, did you have, right? How many letters did you miss because you're trying to be slow? How many X's did you click because you didn't exert that impulse control? That data is data that is automatically uploaded and becomes augmenting that self-report on how well did you focus. The PTSD coach application is another example of this. The VA has a standard sort of cognitive-based therapy treatment for returning vets. Over the course of 2 or 3 months, they're having weekly therapy appointments, and they're given a set of activities to do during their days in between therapy appointments: prolonged exposure, guided relaxation, other stress management activities. And they designed this into a mobile app so that you can either come in and self-rate on your anxiety scores, and it will guide you to one of these activities. You can just come in and choose one that you found useful before. So the biggest difference in they did that before. They had done that before in information they would give to people and try to get them to do it. But now it's on a digital plane, right? And that activity that you did can become diagnostic information for the clinician as well as for yourself, because you, by virtue of having done that, you now have these PCL scores or other anxiety rating scores during the course of your days. You see what activities you've spent more time in. You can sort of see this week versus last week. And so that is designed as a standalone app, and what we're doing with them is actually plumbing the app, as in plumbing, you know, water plumbing, pulling the data off the app, and then pulling the features out of that usage data that can in some way be useful to the clinician at a glance as they're walking into treatment therapy, or in the future if you're looking at a panel of 50 patients to get a sense of where people are and how they're doing, right? So now it's that standard. You come in once a week, right? So maybe some people need to be seen in 3 days, 3 hours, or 3 weeks. And so that ability to begin to personalize that treatment because you have a better sense of how people are doing in between. So self-report, automated off of sensors, and then automated off of other things you're doing on the phone. Other examples that we haven't done yet, but are ones, some great work out of Cindy Pentland's group at the Media Lab, and Tanzim Chowdhury, who's just moved from Dartmouth to Cornell. That people are using the phone to mediate their lives, so pulling off of texting patterns, some really interesting ideas off of pulling off of voice features during their phone calls, for example. A lot of things you can do that take advantage of the devices being used to mediate at least social interaction. One of the things you get with the smartphone, because it has the GPS and the other radios in it that allow it to localize itself, is the ability to set these reminders. So the biggest problem with self-report is remembering to do it and having it be low burden, having it be something that's sustainable. And so smart reminders help. Over time, what's going to help is just being really smart about how much you can already predict what state somebody is in, and then sample it less frequently, and really begin to build reminders and prompts that aren't just based on where you are now and what time it is and when you thought you wanted it sampled, but have more of are based on previous responses and what state you're in. So this is not something that we have done yet. I'm just trying to be clear about things we think about and things we've done. Software is a really insidious in that way because all of our software systems could sort of do anything, right? So it's very tempting to talk about, oh yes, we can do that versus sort of what we've done already. And I think this thing of looking at the history of reporting that people have done and have that inform what you ask and when to make that self-report happen even, be needed even less is of great interest. So that ties directly into an important point is we're often focused on this mobile device, okay? But this is really just this sort of interface and instrument, and most of the heavy lifting increasingly happens on the server side of things, whether you call it the web, the cloud, or a server, okay? And so it's really about the sense making that happens out of it. Maybe it's because you're doing some mashing this up with spatial features in the environment, or maybe it's because of this sort of learning engine that I just described, where you're learning how to prompt somebody based on their past history. And those, there are different data views that then come out of that. You're serving the participant in some cases, and I'll say a little bit more about feedback in a moment. And you're also obviously supporting, and we're all interested in this as innovators in the space. This isn't something that is going directly out to all Kaiser patients, right? Initially, you're trying things out, and we want to enable this rapid iteration, so researcher dashboards are important, not just to be able to author these different campaigns, these different sort of mobile apps and experiences that people are doing, but being able to see what's going on in relevant time, if not real time, and make adjustments over time. And some very interesting work happening here in terms of making that tailoring, not just personalized at any one point, to any individual in a fixed way, but really tailoring these interventions over time. So this gives you this opportunity to not just personalize it at the initially in terms of somebody's condition and demographics and proclivity and preference, but to adapt it over time because you have this whole server engine that's keeping history. That's not trivial to do. You have to figure out what are those adaptations that are relevant and meaningful to do. But the opportunity is there now to do that. Whereas before, having that kind of data about people just wasn't as affordable. We did small scale, actigraphy based data or calling people up or ethnographic, and this really lets us scale that tremendously. And then as system developers, it's still pushing what this device was intended for versus what we're using it for, okay? So doing the constant background data collection still stresses in particular the battery life on devices. And if you just do something really brute force, and the easiest way you can think of doing them, which is a good place to start usually, right? Why overcomplicate things? You won't get more than 5 or 6 hours out of most smartphones, which isn't sufficient. That's not continuous monitoring. That's 5 or 6 hours of monitoring. And so by now, lots of people have worked in this space over time, and we're better at figuring out smart ways of duty cycling. So you don't have to be sampling the GPS continuously when you're still in your office and the accelerometer says that the device isn't moving, right? So you can start to use lower power devices to do smart things to turn on higher power devices. And there's a lot of information you can get off by looking at the system analytics off the phone that are not just relevant to how is your system performing as you're piloting it, but starts to be actually interesting for other reasons in terms of what it tells you about the user. So interaction with their phone is something that you, by running a background process on the device that's monitoring these this usage data, is things that can be used for other purposes. So in Homage, you have a way to author these experience sampling streams. You can run automated mobility, and then all the data is uploaded in a SQL database, and there are some basic data views that you can do and extend. And so, you can start to put things together, again, as you're running a pilot, to start to look across your different users, and you might necessarily think that there's a connection between battery level and how they're interacting with their phone and the surveys they're responding, but it's quite useful to have this real-time, again, relevant time dashboard to see what's going on with the users of the system. And so all different ways you can begin to match these things up to inform how you want to adapt an intervention for a particular user, a new idea for a next pilot, or updates that you need to do to enhance your system. What's getting in the way of use? People often ask me, in this time when not everyone has smartphones, and our system actually, I should have said this before, largely Android-based. Limited resources, and so we support one smartphone platform for the time being. That's not where the heavy lifting is, right? So to do a port of that mobile app to another platform, once you figure it out, isn't really the hard part of the problem. I think people make much too much of this whole issue around platform fragmentation. But since not everyone has smartphones, what do? In the earlier days, we gave people smartphones to use for the course of the study. It's not an attractive solution because, as I said at the beginning, you want people to have this phone be important to their lives and the other aspects of their lives. So increasingly, we're now moved to upgrading people's devices and plans. That's the better path for doing that. And here's just a little bit of data from from a couple of our studies even early on about to what extent people were actually interacting with their phone intensively, which is sort of what you want for this to be the right instrument, and to what extent were they letting their phone go dead, right? These are related measures, and obviously this is just what you would expect, that using their personal phone pays off. So this has been a participatory design process, not so much because that's our methodology or we come from a participatory design culture so much as, well, how else would you do this, right? So, and there are two types of participants. There are the clinical innovators, so the people who work in HIV, who work in obesity, who work in depression, who want to bring new tools to their area of practice, right? And there are the other participants who are the end users who they're, targeting for this. And so we had focus groups and ongoing collaborations with both of those sorts of groups. And just some of the things that come directly out of that. And of course, everything is, as we know, right, so culturally embedded. So this whole thing about taking pictures of your food, right, you can go and look on the internet around what people say about whether it's useful to take pictures of what you eat. And people try to say yes or no, right? There is no yes or no uniformly to that question of whether that is sort of a useful technique to start to build more mindfulness or do behavior change around it. Even in talking about it with the new moms, we work with largely in this moms NIH-funded study around cardiovascular risk factors. We work with largely underserved populations around LA. And when we have focus groups with them, first of all, they're the ones who came up with the idea of the stress button on the surface of the phone. And they wanted to take pictures of their snacking behavior. They thought it would be useful. And now we'll see in the 6-month study we're just doing whether in fact they sustain that and whether in fact you see any utility to it. Their perception is different from what's actually useful. With our Northwestern colleagues, when we went and had a focus group with the South Asian immigrant women that they're looking at around sedentary behavior, they thought we were nuts when we asked if they wanted to take pictures of their food. And the minute it's one of those moments that the minute you ask the question and you even start to see the response, you realize you were nuts, right? Because they were they're largely cooking traditionally, right? And the dish looks the same as their mother's version of the dish and their grandmother's version of the dish, and it was just a simply silly question. So there's no one, and undoubtedly, maybe for their daughters, it's not at all a silly question, and it has to do with age and level of what is your mode of food preparation and food consumption. Everyone has felt that in order to build the habit around self-report, that, sorry, it shouldn't be called triggers, it should be called reminders, buttons I already told you about. Feedback. This is an area in which I'll mention some other people's work who have done much better work than we have on this feedback piece. It's a very important piece. It's a really rich HCI user interface design piece. And what's clear is that in these populations that we talk to, the feedback needs to come on the phone, not on an alternate internet device, which is unfortunate, okay? Because alternate internet devices have bigger screens, much more real estate, there's much more you can do with it. But we, even though we didn't want to hear it, we heard over and over again that by the most part, for the most part, people wanted to see feedback, and everything had to be delivered on the same device. And just more data from things around focus groups, just some things that are relevant. These are all small numbers. None of this is statistically significant, but it's more than not having talked to people at all. We were interested in, since for the most part these studies were designed by the clinical innovators, we're interested in that potential for whether those populations, though, were interested in using it for their own personal self-discovery, since as innovators from the sort of information technology side, that's sort of where we're as interested, but the clinical colleagues we find aren't always as interested. And it around things around ease of use, numbers of surveys that people answered per day, 3, 4 was still found to be fine and not burdensome. The software is intentionally not novel. It's all just based on a lot of open source tools and open data standards. 3 elements to the system. There's the server and the data repository. The details of these things could be replaced by something else, as with good, well-structured systems. It's only the interfaces that matter. There's the mobile device, and there's the way in which people get access to that data. The clinicians and the researchers through internet devices, and the participants through mobile phones. Say another word about this cross-platform issue, and I don't want to, at the same time that I think too much is made of it, I don't want to make too little of it. It is an annoyance factor as we go through our work. You want to go out and do a pilot, you want to recruit a bunch of middle-aged women with lupus, okay? So you already have a restricted population. Maybe you're trying to look at a certain socioeconomic status, and now on top of that, they have to have the right kind of phone. So it is in terms of getting that engine of pilots and doing it rapidly and inexpensively, and starting to, in any one of these things, ultimately, the big healthcare delivery groups will go and do large-scale projects where they have some standardized, this is part of standardized care. But there's a time between now and then, and in all these different conditions, where there's just this opportunity cost in sitting back and waiting, in which we're not learning how do you do this effectively. What is the experience sampling version of that measure around symptom reporting? And so we need to get out there early and start to experiment. And it's too expensive to experiment with multiple native apps developed across all platforms, even for these smaller pilots. So HTML5, how many of you get a cash miss on that term? You can put up a web application, and anybody with a web browser, right, because of standards, can go and access that web application. Why can't we do the same thing on mobile devices? So, one thing that's been emerging, HTML5, it's the latest version of HTML, that standard that has helped the web to work and to be able to be used by people without any coordination with them as to their browser or not, unless they use Internet Explorer, and then things continuously don't work. Can't give a talk without a little bit of Microsoft bashing, but HTML5 is in part designed with recognition of these mobile devices out there. So you can create mobile applications. There's a really nice open source software developed by some folks in the UC system, actually, called Mobile Web Framework, which is getting some traction, where you can create a mobile web-based interaction that will deliver onto your phone depending on its capability. So you don't have to rewrite an app for the iPhone or the Android or a feature phone or whichever feature phone it is. If it's web-enabled, it will be able to deliver it to its level of capability. It's very good if you're doing largely media delivery. You want a campus map. You want a map of your clinic. You want to do some kind of that, patient education side of things. And it's starting to allow you to also do some location tagging on images and some responses. So some data captured by the individual, simple experience sampling, you can now do through web-enabled applications. You do not need to do native app development if all you're doing is simple form of experience sampling. But if you want actigraphy and mobility, you want a go, no-go game where response time is important, it's going to take some time where you still need your native version of that application. Things that are lower latency take advantage of sensors on the phone. So for those of you thinking about sort of where to step in this space, to get to everybody, do I have to go all the way back to text messaging? I don't think you do necessarily have to go all the way back to text messaging. I think you can start to do some things that are much easier to answer through a web interface on a feature phone than it is through a text-based interface. And I'm happy to follow up on any of that with you. So just to summarize, the features of the system were focused on things that would make it usable for the end user participant. Experience sampling reminders, some battery preserving techniques, and some visualizations to them. This is the one that we suck the most on. Functionality for the health innovators in terms of authoring these surveys. You do not have to spend a year deciding what you're going to ask people, because you're going to deliver this questionnaire intervention and for 2 years and then analyze your results. That is just not the way to think about this, because you can be starting with an initial set of questions and initial kind of experience sampling, and you just push new forms of that questioning. Not only would you adapt it in person, but you do quick iterative rounds to determine what is actually meaningful here, and that will change over time. So survey authoring is not something you do once at the beginning of a study, and that's the instrument you use for the rest of time. And then we've done everything open source and tried to support system analytics to help with development in this space. So let me end by just saying a few words about where there are, the state of the art needs to be pushed a little bit. Battery. Won't go into the details of this. You know, this is the favorite topic still of CS conferences in this space, from census to UbiQuity to pervasive. And it's not a made-up problem, and there are plenty of made-up problems in all of those conferences and in every CS conference I see. There are plenty of made-up problems. This one is still really authentic. It does get in our way, and it actually needs to be solved and needs ever better solutions, even though it's been going on for some amount of time. And I, again, won't go into detail on that. Another example of something that's been, pretty well studied is using location. There is this real opportunity of using location to trigger things and to prompt you about reminding. I'm trying to retrain myself not to use that term trigger, since most people in the health context associated with external triggers to a behavior, and I'm talking about a reminder, right? So using location as a way to annotate data as metadata, but also as context for when to prompt data and to look for patterns. That's one of the very powerful things about these devices, and that we're able to capture data around people when they're out and moving about. But that's not you don't think in terms of GPS coordinates, you think in terms of more semantic location. So there's interesting work, again, that goes on from census to ubiquity to pervasive to other about how do you start to support more semantic notions of location. How do you discover your important places, and then when somebody can say where they want to be prompted, if they've walked around with the device for a couple days, it's going to offer them a couple of places that are important to them, because that's where they spend their time. And they can label them as home or work or the coffee shop that I go to at a break. And then that becomes the semantic label that I can use to assign my reminders. And interestingly enough, when you go up to that semantic level, maybe you can use that for some of your resource management and in your duty cycling story to be smarter about when you're turning on different sensors, because different places are more important than others. When, in the context of open mHealth, which I'll end with in a moment, when we looked at the space and said, where is it most meaningful to try to get a community forming that's doing a lot more modular sharing of tools and techniques in this space, we determined that this was really in the context of this sense-making, this InfoViz. People have come out with a whole bunch of different apps and techniques for capturing on the phone, even for interacting with the user. But how do you take those time series and do something useful with them and pull out the features? That's where we need rapid evolution, and it's multiple parts to it. And so we're creating this, again, everything open, scaffolding for creating this processing pipeline so that you can take your experience sampling streams and your mobility streams, pull out what's a relevant feature for somebody looking at lupus symptoms or MS symptoms is going to be different from the features you want to pull out for somebody that's relevant to depression. And you should be able to sort of take the best of breed and do what's relevant to you and merge that into the dashboard. So I think this is one of the most important areas in which we're working. Feedback to the individual, right? So you're going to make sense making, and then some of that data is coming back to the individual themselves around behavior change. And UbiFit is still the best example of this. How could that be? How many of you know the UbiFit paper? Okay, so it's great work, but God damn it, it shouldn't still be the greatest work. Okay, it was done a long time ago by the folks at UW and Intel. The story being that they were doing physical activity monitoring, and they fed back to an ambient display on the PDA at the time, and it grew a garden based on reaching your physical activity goals for the day, and at the end of the week it would wipe it clean, and then people got pissed off, so there would be butterflies behind, based on previous week's achievement. And yes, if you don't want to walk around with flowers on your phone, yes, of course, they had the notion that they would switch it to something that was more acceptable to you if you don't like the idea of flowers on your phone. And then, so there is a more modern rendition of this that Tanzim is doing. I mentioned her earlier, now up at Cornell's Information School. And she has it's a display in which the rate of movement of the fish is based on your level of physical activity. Whether there are multiple of them schooled versus just a few isolated is based on social interaction. And the background light level, how light or dim it is based on how you're doing on your sleep hygiene. But that whole notion of that you have an ambient display that has multiple parameters and that at a glance is in your face or on your mind. And we need a lot more of this, and we need much better tie-ins to social media. So in the meantime, there's all this incredible stuff going on in the social media context. And again, just due to limited resources and can't do everything at once, we personally in my group have insufficiently actually tied into what's been going on game mechanics and social media. And it's just right for that. Can't talk about this subject without talking about privacy, right? Because these are very telling traces. That's why it's so interesting, because there's so much for the potential for people to see their own story, to tell stories, to relate their clinical story, but it's also very telling. I don't really care so much about cameras on the street. I care a lot about sharing my continuous geotrace, because once that's mashed up, spatiotemporal geotrace, that really tells the story of your life. And when you add to that these experience sampling streams, again, whether this is a technical problem or a cultural one, and that there should just be other options for what happens with this data. So the notion of personal data vaults, that nobody gets to mine until you release data to them, is one that is, I think, an area that's very interesting to work on. It's easier said than done, because the usability, as with all privacy and security things, the bane of their existence often end up being in their usability. You can come up with some elaborate scheme that supports all kinds of policies, but it doesn't really support all kinds of policies because nobody actually can bother to take the time to use it or learn it or maintain it. So while I think that there's a huge need for different forms of privacy in this space, it's a hard problem, and one that I expect is largely a usability one. And then finally, to get where Chuck started off in the introduction, and this nonprofit. The nonprofit is about trying to create a community, right? Not suggesting it's going to be at the scale of the internet and the IETF, but it's really in that model. There are lots of startups in this space, as well as existing ventures, and lots of faculty and researchers around the country who are interested in exploring this space. Some of them are trying to sort of own the full pipe, and they want to monetize the full end-to-end application. That's all fine. Many of them want to monetize something special about what they're delivering, but not the whole thing. So open source, that I think most of the people in this room probably understand, is not something that's anti-commercial, right? It's been a remarkable phenomenon that has promoted commercialization and innovation. The idea being that instead of spending your time recreating the commodity components down here in the middle, you put your innovation effort up at the top, or sort of sensors and things down here, but let's focus up here. And that's where you monetize, that's where you brand. And the benefits of it, as with things open source, is first of all, you have more resources to put there because you're not recreating the commodity components. And equally important, those commodity components are going to be more robust because lots of people are using them and developing them. So the bricks and mortar becomes more robust, and you spend your time innovating correctly. What we need to do with this graphic is squash these things together so that you see that the area of the purple is smaller when you do everything siloed, but I haven't done that yet. So Open mHealth is really about trying to catalyze this open community by actually having an open infrastructure for shared modular tools where people can create them and get them. And what Robert Wood Johnson and CHCF, we're happy to say, sort of recognizes that it takes a little bit of the way the internet happened was through government funding, right? How that would never have just happened based on market forces. And then a lot of things around open source. They had an initial injection that sort of then floats all the boats higher in what's obviously been a huge commercial success beyond anyone's dreams, right? So we have to get this, we have to have it be that by starting with the open platform, you get some advantage. When you're a startup, you can't be doing this because philosophically you agree with it. You have to get to market fast. So we have to get to the point where we have these commodity modules there so that this becomes a faster path to exploration and implementation, not just one that is more robust over time. And so then allowing innovators and entrepreneurs to focus on those pieces. Ida Sim, my colleague here, I think has a really powerful view on how this can also just a little bit flip this directionality of how we think about health innovation, which is instead of research inference always being about doing a population study and then figuring out how to bring it down to the individual, is to start to help the individual, and you're doing it because you're doing this self-care. I'm coming back to my 3 nested feedback loops. Because you're giving them tools for self-care, you can learn more about individuals and then begin to switch that inference up to make those population scale inferences. Our first driving pilot is with PTSD Coach that I mentioned to you before. And just to sort of end where I started, if you're looking for places to innovate from an IT, informatics, CS perspective, huge opportunities and needs when it comes to, in particular, HCI, and when it comes to the sense-making and statistical inference and machine learning and adaptive designs. A lot you can do with existing techniques, but I think this could even be, since people often want to hear about what papers and PhD theses they might end up being able to write, I think there's also opportunities there. And then finally, we have a separate project using participatory sensing in the high schools to help students learn about data. So they're more than just robotics might be a hands-on way to become interested in computing and data. And using participatory sensing, we've been thinking a lot about sort of using this as a tool for increasing computational thinking and literacy. And so around health as well, if it becomes an opportunity not to just feel stymied by the fact that you don't think people's literacy is high enough to adapt it, but if you start to bring the usability to a point that you can start to engage in it, this can actually be perhaps a vector by which people do become more data literate and more systematic, if you will, sort of scientific citizens in contrast to citizen science. And with that, I think I'm over time and I'll end.